Good morning. My name's John Tillman. I'd like to welcome you all to my audition to replace Chris Wallace at Fox News. Okay, I'm just kidding. Some people are applying for that job, but I'm here today at Atlas Network's Liberty Forum and welcoming you to Which Way for the USA in 2021 post-election. And what an election it was. I'm the director of the Center for the U.S. and Canada for the Atlas Network. I'm also chairman of the Liberty Justice Center, the Liberty Justice Center, the Freedom News Foundation, and of course the CEO of the Illinois Policy Institute. And no, I'm not applying for Chris Wallace's job. So glad you're here with us. I'm going to start out today by setting the table a little bit about the election, what I think happened, and then we'll bring in our panelists in a few minutes to discuss their views on the election and the implications for 2021. It seems to me, looking back, there were two outcomes that were very, very likely when the pandemic occurred and most of the states decided to do massive mail-in balloting for the very first time. I discussed this with some friends. Maybe you had this discussion. One outcome would be that President Trump would win re-election narrowly and appeared to be ahead in multiple states on election night. And then as the mail-in ballots continued to be counted throughout the evening, his gaps would close, the late races would get tighter and tighter, but then counting would be stopped and President Trump would win re-election. The implications of that outcome, I think, for all of us were indicated by boards going up all around the cities throughout the United States that, thank God, were not needed. And that is what seemed to start to happen. The other outcome I think that many of us predicted could happen is what has actually happened, which is that President Trump started out ahead on election night. And then as the ballots came in, eventually he fell behind in enough key states, as we all now know, Pennsylvania, Georgia, Michigan, Wisconsin, and Arizona. And Joe Biden would eventually eke out enough electoral votes to become the presumptive winner of the 2020 presidential election. And that is exactly what's happened. For our purposes here, though I know many of you will have lots of opinions about whether the recounts should go on at all or whether they are going to result in a changing of the outcome, we are going to assume that we have President-elect Biden and that he will be inaugurated in January of 2021. So we're going to frame our policy discussions around that outcome. But it is really an interesting time for the United States, and I think in many ways the rest of the world. The United States election has really resulted in a split decision in many ways. You have at the presidential level a very narrow victory for Joe Biden, as I've said. It looks like the Republicans will very narrowly, depending on what happens in the Georgia runoffs, hold on to a narrow majority in the Senate. Most surprisingly, perhaps of all, is that the Democrats actually lost seats in the U.S. House of Representatives, and their margin for error in the House now is much closer. Meanwhile, across the country, there was a red wave just as much as there was a blue wave, and they sort of crashed into one another. Republicans picked up an additional 3 chambers in the state legislative bodies around the United States and held on to all their governorships and now hold 27 of the 50 gubernatorial offices. So what does that mean for all of us? I think what it means in many ways, particularly given the role that the media played in this election, that the country remains deeply divided and with great difficulty ahead. And the question is, can we come together? Years ago, I developed a concept that I talk about a lot, which is called the political vice. The basic idea of the political vice is that you have a 3-sided vice. So imagine a 3-sided vice. And in the middle of this vice are political decision makers. On one side of the vice, you have media that applies pressure to those political decision makers. On the other side of the vice, you have public opinion and the people of America applying pressure to the political decision makers. And at the bottom of the vice, you have elite influencers who not only apply pressure to political decision makers, they affect the way the media and the public processes and perceives public policy and political decisions. The output through the 4th side, the top of the vice, is really dependent on who's working the vice most effectively, forces from the political left or forces from the political right. That has been how I've seen politics working for many, many years. But I think we're in the middle of a transition that I think is somewhat disturbing, at least from my point of view, and so I'll share this theory with you, and we'll talk about a little bit with the panelists in terms of how they think policy will be put forward through the political system. Now, instead of having the political decision makers in the political vice, you've got the people of the United States in the middle of that political vice, under constant pressure. You still have the elite influencers at the bottom of the vice, applying pressure to the to the public to succumb to, if you will, submit, if you will, to their dictates about what should be happening from a public policy point of view. And these elites are bipartisan. It is not a left or right, a Democrat, Republican. There is some unity, particularly in this city where I sit today, Washington, D.C. And then you have the media and the political class all working together to try to get the American people to unify behind a point of view. And I think this creates a really interesting future, especially as we look at President Trump's first term likely coming to an end, and how he has made the Republican brand much more focused on the working class, the middle class, and particularly a lot of people want to use the term populism, but I would really just say working people versus elites. And then I think what's really fascinating about President Trump in terms of rewriting the equation as he leaves office is his increase in non-white voting, the highest for Republican nominees since 1960. I think all of these factors, the pressures of the media, the elites, the political class with the American people in a pandemic world, really create great challenges for us from a public policy point of view. And now, with that in mind, let's bring in our panelists. And I think what I'll do here is bring in all three of them at the same time, and then we'll have a little bit of a conversation. First up will be Robert A. George. He is a writer for Bloomberg Editorial Opinion. And Robert, it is great to have you with us. Thanks for joining us virtually. And then we have Emily Ekins from the Cato Institute. Emily, thanks for the very nice wave. And then we have the aptly named Lindsay Young Craig. I have to say, Lindsay, most people don't use an adjective as their middle name to brag about their youth, but if that's what you want to do, we'll go with that. And Robert, why don't you lead us off? I've set the table a little bit. Feel free to riff off of that or go in a direction of your own choosing. Tell us a little bit about what you think this election meant and what it portends for 2021 from a policy point of view.
Given the amount of information that you're asking for us to deliver here, I'm thinking that instead of Chris Wallace, maybe you want to replace Alex Trebek. I don't know. Well, maybe that's too soon. I'm not sure.
Never too soon.
No, you actually mentioned one of the things that that was kind of going through my mind, in both in the days coming up to the election and just in some of the preliminary exit polls that we've seen, is what I think what was rather surprising for many was how well President Trump did, as you said, with working class voters, and particularly the non-white working class. And what came out in particularly in Florida and in Texas was the president expanding his numbers with Latino voters, and also slightly expanding his numbers with Black voters as well. And I don't want to. I think it's important to not overstate that, because the Black numbers, he got about 8% back in 2016, and the numbers seem to suggest that that's gone up to about 12% in 2020. And in terms of the breakdown, some numbers suggest among Black men that may have been in the 15 to 18% range. Again, exit polls we should look at as skeptically as any of the other polls, which obviously turned out to be incredibly off this year. But we can sort of guess just in terms of geography, and it's definitely the case that look at Miami-Dade County, for example. The president definitely got more votes out of that broader area of Latinos and Black working class than he got 4 years ago. I think that's rather interesting going forward. But I would also say that to the extent that this post-election period where President Trump is questioning the results in a whole in a four states primarily, and raising questions about the vote in, say, Detroit and Philadelphia, and other Republicans are talking about irregularities in Georgia as well. I think they want to be careful about that, because if it suggests that even if it's small numbers, if it just suggests that Black voters are looking at Republicans in a small portion of Black voters are looking at Republicans in a slightly more maybe optimistic or potential way than they have been in the past. Sure, definitely exploit that, work with that, and find out what kind of messaging works. However, one thing that is sort of the deal maker and deal breaker for African Americans just broadly is questions about voting around voting. When I first started, my first big job in politics was working at the Republican National Committee some 30 years ago, and I would go through some of their communications material, and their big talking points were, well, a greater percentage of Republican senators and House members voted for the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act in the 1960s than Democrats did, and that was like a major talking point that the quote Party of Lincoln was pushing, which was great, and that was absolutely true. But now we're in this post-election day period, and the president is, as the kids say, throwing shade on voting in the in significantly Black populated cities like Philadelphia and Detroit, or states where the Black vote is very significant, like Georgia. If he continues to question those results and seemingly wants to overturn those results, and Republicans in general, as in the days going up to the election, tries to make voting harder, that's going to run headlong into any prospects that individual Republicans may have in terms of making pointed messages towards the African American community on things like entrepreneurship and basic working class issues. If you've got to know what the main issue is, the main deal breaker for a given community is before you start rattling off your platform points. But the fact that there is a slight movement towards the Republican Party to trying to create a multiracial, working class oriented party, that's fantastic, and I think it also presents challenges for Democrats as well in terms of their talking points, because just talking about white supremacy as a major vote getter becomes a little bit more complicated when the opposition party, yes, it's going to be heavily majority white, but there is a significant minority non-white group within that other party that you also have to address as well.
Thank you, Robert, very much. Very interesting, a lot to chew on there. Emily Ekins from the Cato Institute. I have to imagine that the Cato Institute is just thrilled because right now you've essentially split government, narrow margins in both the House and the Senate, a president that won a very narrow election, split government all around the country. Isn't this Cato's dream moment that there could be just completely, a lockdown from a legislative point of view as opposed to a pandemic point of view, and nothing will get done? Isn't that the libertarian dream?
Well, look, I'm a pollster, so I'm talking about what people think. But I think many people of all political stripes, don't want the government to overreach. And when you have divided government, what that means is you have to reach a higher threshold of consensus before you actually make major changes. Just because you get, say 51% of the vote doesn't mean that you can just totally remake the system. You really want to have broader consensus, get 2/3 or so of people really on board with something before you make major changes. So I think divided government really allows for building broader consensus. Which is important. But I'm sure that many people here have lots of questions about what on earth happened with polling in 2020. And I have to tell you, I wondered going into this election if we were going to have a repeat of 2016 in terms of the polling, similarly with what happened in Brexit. There seems to be something in the air right now where polls are not getting it quite right. So let's talk about that. Let's break that down a little bit. So first, it seems like once all the votes come in, now remember, there's a lot of mail-in ballots, and so that's why some things are changing from Election Day, because Democrats who are more concerned about the pandemic were far more likely to mail their ballots in. So once all those ballots are counted, what we'll probably find is that the polls were off by about 3 to 4 percentage points. Now, a lot of pollsters will say that the state level results were often within the margin of error, but there's one thing you have to notice is that they were all wrong in the same direction, that the error was not randomly distributed, meaning it's not like, Trump was leading in some of the Florida polls, and then Biden was leading in some of the other polls, and it went back and forth. No, it was like Biden, 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 all the way down. Similarly, for the Senate. Most people paying attention did not think Susan Collins from Maine was going to win re-election. They didn't think that Tom Tillis was going to win in North Carolina. So what happened? Susan Collins won her seat. It appears that Tom Tillis has won re-election. Why were the polls off? So after 2016, a lot of people thought, a lot of the pollster class thought, well, it's because we failed to account in our samples for white voters without college degrees. Donald Trump really connected with a lot of new voters and kind of brought people out of the woodwork that hadn't traditionally been voting consistently. So this year, people thought they had fixed the problem by fixing those samples, by making sure they were including a larger number of people that didn't have college degrees, particularly white voters without college degrees, since they were so heavily, more in favor of Trump over Biden. But that doesn't seem to be enough. They were still off. And so people are asking questions. Why were the polls off? And I think that there was a poll that the Cato Institute that I conducted that might shed some light on what was going on. Over the summer, we conducted a survey that found that 62% of Americans say that they have political views that they're afraid to share in this current political environment. We found some people felt even more extremely. About a third of Americans said that they were afraid that if people at their jobs, at work, found out their political views, they could get fired or miss out on job opportunities. That means not getting that promotion that you're working so hard toward because of your political views. How might that affect things? Now, there was one other finding that was very important. There was an asymmetry in who felt that way. So the more conservative, if you were moderate or conservative, you became much more likely to fear expressing your political views. The only political group who felt like they could share their views were people who identified as strong liberals. So kind of the far political left is the only group that feels like they can share their views. Do you think that could impact how polls were reading the electorate this time around? So there's a debate going on right now among pollsters about, were people lying to the pollsters about who they were planning to vote for, or did these voters just not answer? They just didn't even answer the phone, didn't even take the survey via email. In the past, election surveys have been fairly accurate. So this is a new phenomenon. This is not something that happens all the time. So some additional research has been done to try to figure out who were these, shall we say, shy Trump voters, people who at the end of the day showed up for Trump and other Republican candidates, but in the polls were not being detected. And what they've found thus far is that they were college-educated white voters, particularly living in affluent suburban neighborhoods. What's going on? Were they not answering the phone because they were afraid, hey, if someone finds out, they connect my email or they connect my phone number to who I am, I could lose my job because of who I'm voting for? Were they just lack social trust? What's going on? And so I think this presents some very serious problems for a liberal democracy and a free society when you have many people so afraid to express their political views, not even just about Trump, but even if they're going to be voting for Susan Collins of Maine. She's not a particularly, controversial person in most circles. The other question I think this raises is that I think many people would agree that Donald Trump is not a typical political candidate or president, and that he has offended many people by violating social convention and many received wisdoms. And so the question is, why were people willing to vote for him even when they were afraid to admit it? What are they reacting to? What's going on in our society that people feel strongly about and they feel like they can't talk about it? It seems like likely those topics involve the issues of immigration, gender, race, and sexuality. A lot of the conversation that we had this summer, good conversation about police reform, also turned into more extreme forms of defunding the police. And I think a lot of people felt, and we heard this from a lot of Democratic congressional not just candidates, but lawmakers, where they felt like they lost seats in the House because of defunding the police. It's not that I've done polling on this. Americans support reforming the police. Americans have very little tolerance for the kind of problems that people have raised about what exists in current American policing. But what they had a problem with was the idea of let's just abolish the police or let's defund the police. And just because people say, well, that's not what we mean, we actually just mean reform. It's like, well, you're using the word defund. And regular people who are not reading the news every single day, all they heard you say was you want to get rid of the police department. So those types of things are not popular. And then people felt like they can't talk about it. They felt like they would get in trouble with their friends. They would get trouble at work for just saying something that a couple of years ago was fairly mundane, that they don't want to get rid of the police. It could also be more extreme or more controversial opinions that people hold that they're afraid to talk about. Whatever it is, I think it's going to make it very challenging for our society to work through complicated and important public policy issues when people feel like they cannot be honest and sincere when they discuss those policies. So what was probably going to need to happen is for us to try to work towards a more open and tolerant zeitgeist. We allow people to make mistakes, or we allow people to, express their views, and people can push back and say, have you considered this other evidence? Have you considered this other thing? But right now, social trust in institutions, particularly the media and academia, just kind of large institutions, is, at the lowest levels it's been. And that's going to make it very hard to build that consensus and social trust that's necessary to get people to feel like they can engage and participate in our liberal democracy.
Emily, thank you for that. It's really interesting. Monday night, I was in Kansas City with two colleagues, and we were talking to the bartender, who was 30 years old, and a woman in her, I guess, mid-40s, about a variety of things. The hotel had just been rehabbed, and and she was the interior designer that led that team that did it. And we had this lovely conversation among all of us for about an hour and 15 minutes, just really great. And then she eventually asked one of my colleagues, what do you do? And he started to talk about being an advocate for free markets, the founding principles. And the bartender and this individual turned on a dime with the most voracious hostility. And this is, I think, a really good example of why people are afraid to talk about what they believe. And I think this goes on in bars in Kansas City. It goes on around the family dinner table and among cousins and extended family and friends. And I think it's a real thing and a real challenge. Lindsay, very young Craig, you've been waiting patiently. Tell us what you're thinking at the National Review Institute in terms of both the election, the results, whatever analysis you have, as well as what you think it bodes for the future.
Yeah, well, thanks so much, John, and thanks so much to the Atlas Network for hosting this. I just wanted to take a moment to say today is Veterans Day here in the United States, and I think it's a really important time to say thank you and to express our gratitude for all of those who have served in the uniform, not just here, in the United States military, but also among all of our allies around the world, protecting our freedoms. And, for all of you in different places around the world, you're probably looking at the United States thinking this is just unbelievable. We're so inward focused right now. And I think that we normally have such a global feeling about our friends and neighbors around the world. And we know that there are certainly nefarious people, little creatures, not wishing well and want to take our freedoms away. So I really express my really sincere gratitude for all of the people who serve in the armed forces today. So, post-election, holy cow. I mean, I know that I was looking at Christmas cards recently, and you can get cards now that are saying 2020 good riddance, and wow, what kind of a year was that? We've just been waiting for this moment as one of a couple that are allowing us, I think, to then think about the future. I think when you're looking towards an election, you're looking towards one point in time. But now, when it concludes, you can actually get to the business of what's next. And there's a couple of things that, just struck me. John and I were talking about this in the group when we were talking earlier. One of the things that bothers me so much as somebody who has real libertarian roots is that putting so much focus on a presidential election as opposed to midterm elections or other important state elections means that we are just focusing entirely too much on the executive branch. And we focus too much on the executive branch because there's too much power there. There's too much money, there's too much controls, there's too many regulations, there's too much executive orders, and it affects people's real lives. And that is something that I think we in the liberty movement in the United States could really focus on, is that there are really important policies that are being made in the states and in localities all across the country. And that's really where everyone's focus should be, and not as much in the power of the executive. James Madison warned us of this. We can go back and read it. The words are still in English and you can understand it. And it would do us all good to go back and remind ourselves of those warnings that our founders had. So there's two main takeaways that I have from this election. Like I said, we're always looking for what can we do next? What is the messaging? How do we capture the hearts and minds of Americans across the country in ways that I think highlight the limited government principles that we adhere to, that we know work, and that we think creates a government structure allowing the highest and best human flourishing. And so two things that stuck out to me. One is just the fact that there's been some, as Emily was saying, some very strong messaging that has gone on during this administration. I think it's been really interesting to see how bold the president has been, as well as a lot of members of his cabinet, very bold and very strong, almost caustic language about overreach of the government. It's not always been, I think, contextualized in the way that then is maybe doesn't then also sort of spur like a gigantic backlash from the other side. But I think that there's something really interesting there, because the real principles of a free society are like in there somewhere. And I think that there's a lot more that we can do with that. I'd also couple that with the other big takeaway that I have from this election so far and looking at the results, and it's one that both John and Robert touched on already, and that's looking at some of the minority groups and their turnout rate, as well as how they actually voted. We've been doing some more work, or looking to do some more work in Hispanic communities. We have a project very focused on capitalism that we say we're going to explain, define, and defend capitalism, and to be unabashed about it. And I think that there's those two takeaways that I have, both about the messaging and being bold and really not backing down on what your messaging is, coupled with some communities in the United States that have not necessarily always been spoken to directly and with respect, and from our side, and really making sure that we're going into these communities and explaining that economic choice, being able to make decisions for themselves on where to live, how they want to raise their families, how they want to operate their businesses. Those are principles of a free society, probably reasons why most of them came here or ancestrally did. And so that is something that we advocate for, probably on the Republican side of the ledger, and that the left has this continued message of what I would consider a sort of soft bigotry of low expectations, one that says, you don't really know how to choose schools for your kids. You don't really need to feed your children, which is like one of my biggest bugaboos. You know, in New York City, they feed 1 million kids a year. And so when school's out on a snow day, it's like, how do you get people food? Families should feed their families, and we should help them do that. But that kind of decision-making, I think that we should respect people to be able to choose for themselves. So I think that there's a lot of opportunity going forward. And, you know, one of the things that we used to say, I used to work at the Manhattan Institute for Policy Research, and we used to say that you need to be clear and articulate about your principles and explain and educate them to people in a way that is compassionate and understands the perspective that they're coming from, which might not be the same as yours. But if you can explain that in a way that's persuasive, they'll come along. And then you've created the parade for others to join and for politicians to jump in front of, because we know that unless you're Donald Trump, you're not creating your own parade. So that is, I think, the role of the liberty movement here in the United States, and we're looking forward to playing an active role in that, and hopefully to be leaders, because I think that the messaging that we have of choice and responsibility is one that resonates with all communities, and we should give the respect to the communities that deserve that message the most.
Thank you, Lindsay. I think this is one of the great challenges we face. Choice and opportunity is an important part of it, but I think there's a competition that goes on in the minds of many people, which is a lot of people live, especially in the pandemic world, with fear and insecurity about the future. And that is, one side says the way to satisfy or alleviate, mitigate your fear and insecurity is with always the government's hand coming in and actually reducing your choice, but providing you with some sort of safety net, which I always say creates an artificial ceiling on the upside potential. I think one of the more interesting, and that's really in competition with the idea of opportunity and choice and you know, a better tomorrow than you have today. And I think what's interesting about prior to the pandemic is Black unemployment, Hispanic unemployment, record lows, overall unemployment record lows, the income gap closing between the poor and the middle class. And I think, you know, at Atlas Network Center for the U.S. and Canada, one of our priorities has been and will continue to be in 2021 is poverty reduction. I think that the tightness of this election and those numbers that I just quoted that happened during the pre-pandemic years really do create an opportunity to try to find policies that bring both sides together and really to start working on common ground to reduce poverty, close the income gap, and through some of that, try to reduce the attractiveness to so many of group identity politics versus a past tradition that I think is even controversial to say, but I'll say it because I like to be controversial, which is the melting pot, that we all come together and live in a common stew, if you will. We're unique, we're different, we bring our own uniqueness to it. So as we move along here and we think about 2021, Robert, tell us what you're thinking. What would you like to see happen in the Biden administration, in Congress, and around the states to find some policies where there is common ground and we can actually bring people together rather than continuing to have division?
Well, I'd like to take a look at what's going on in the schools over the last several years. Well, actually, if we went back to say 2009, 2010, the Obama-Biden administration, while a liberal one, while a progressive one, it was open to education alternatives like charter schools and things of that nature. The Secretary of Education at the time, Arne Duncan, who'd come out of Chicago, was very pro charters, and the administration supported lifting caps in the states that had them. In the years since, progressives, partly pushed by teachers unions, have their hostility towards charters has just kind of grown exponentially. And I'm in New York, and I've been seeing that. Biden, who had been, because he was vice president at the time, was generally supportive of charters. While on the campaign trail, has also now started to reflect that hostility towards charters. The thing is, though, charters are very popular in the constituencies that serve them. Particularly African Americans and Latinos. So, given we have this incredibly strong divide, and a literal divide in Washington, where the Democrats have lost a few seats in the House, it's depending on what happens in Georgia. Republicans will either have like a one or two vote margin, or could just be tied. I'm hopeful that basic framework is going to temper any overt hostility that whoever ends up running the Department of Education might have against alternatives to the traditional public school structure that either may be developing now, or is developing, or isn't, or is in place, and allow those structures, whether it's charters or a greater encouragement for homeschooling, which, because of the pandemic, we're seeing more parents, both on the left and the right, embrace, but they could use, if not direction, just some assistance and support from the federal government. So those are my hopes. But I think that, whether that's going to come true, I don't know. But that's definitely going to be a source of friction.
Are you going to talk to Michael Bloomberg about the money spent in Florida and ask for just a little piece of that back? I mean, it seems like that's a good idea for you, right?
I think this is an appropriate place where the journalist in me says no comments.
Hey, Emily, over at the Cato Institute, what have you discerned from a policy opportunity point of view? What are you going to poll on over the next several weeks prior to the inauguration in January, assuming that all goes forward as expected? What kind of, have you seen any glimmers of issues where there could be bipartisan support and some cooperation? Emily, we have you on mute. I'm not sure either that.
Sorry about that.
There we go.
This may come as a surprise, and it might be kind of refreshing to know that, as it turns out, we do not base our polling just on the politics and the presidential election cycle. So we actually have a couple of polls in our pipeline. One will be on immigration and identity, and the other is going to be looking at speech issues, not really free speech, because that is protected by the First Amendment, but the idea of being able to express yourself, kind of the social sanction on political expression, and specifically looking at technology platforms and social media and how that's influencing our ability to express ourselves. So some interesting things on the pipeline. But when it comes to this election, what kinds of policies should we be thinking about? So the first is, I think that we learned a lot when Democrats not only didn't gain seats in the House as they had expected, but actually lost seats. Kind of put this in perspective, I think some of the Republican lawmakers, like kind of within, talking to insiders, said that it would be a good night if Republicans only lost 5 seats. But instead, they actually gained perhaps 11 to 13 seats. And this obviously is very concerning to Democratic lawmakers, because they're asking themselves, why? Why did they lose these seats? They thought it would be fairly easy. Well, it was favored that the Democrats would also take back the Senate. Now that's kind of up in the air, because we don't know what's going to happen with those Georgia runoffs. But those tend to lean Republican, given past voting behavior. So Democrats have been asking themselves, what does this all mean? And so there was this conference call, as you probably heard, that kind of certain aspects of this conference call among House Democrats got leaked. And what they were talking about was how they felt that the appearance of socialism, the appearance of the support of socialism, did not go over well, particularly with many Latino Americans who have ancestry or roots from Nicaragua, Venezuela, Bolivia. So it's not just Cuban Americans living in Florida who have that experience with Fidel Castro, but these are other people moving from parts of Latin America that have dealt with socialistic economic systems and it hasn't gone well. They don't want more of that here in the United States. And so the Trump campaign seemed to really paint the Democratic side as being far more supportive of socialistic policies. And then there were some Democrats who actually kind of associate themselves with the Democratic Socialistic moniker. And so that, I think, did not go over well with a lot of constituencies that were expected to vote very heavily for the Democrats. And although Hispanic Americans did vote, far more for the Democrats than Republicans, Trump gained considerably among Latino voters. And so people believe that that's part of the reason. They felt like perhaps people had overstepped on this idea of Medicare for all, to have kind of government-run healthcare was one step too far. That doesn't mean they're opposed to, say, something like the Affordable Care Act, something kind of in the middle, but they don't want to go too far. And so I think that I think that this perhaps could be an opportunity where Democrats in the White House know that they need to make sure that they don't go too far in the socialistic direction. And I think that's something that's very important to point out, is that socialism isn't just this binary thing that you're socialist or you're not. It's about central economic planning. How much is the government planning when it comes to a particular industry? How involved are they? And I think we should do as best a job as we can to really explain this to our fellow Americans about what socialistic central planning is and what it does. I think Democrats have gotten the message that they don't have kind of this blue wave mandate to kind of push through some more ambitious policies of their progressive left. So that's one thing. I also think, to echo some of the things that Robert had said, I think school choice is something that could perhaps people could make progress on. And the reason is that in this hyper-polarized environment where people are afraid to express themselves from certain political corners, school choice is something that actually can bring a lot of people together, because you have high support among millennials, Hispanic, and African American parents who traditionally vote Democratic, and you also get support from Republicans as well for school choice. And this is something that can kind of bring people together and build that consensus. So those are two areas that I'm thinking a lot about, as the next few months unfold.
Thank you, Emily. Lindsay, at National Review Institute, I'm sure you're planning Q1, the programmatic calendar, thinking about the policies you want to promote, what opportunities there might be. I think one of the things that is particularly, all of these issues that have been mentioned so far, I agree, are interesting and I think bode well. I think the great challenge, a couple of them. One is that on the Democrat side, their victory was in part fueled by the power of public sector unions, and in particular teachers unions, who will oppose these reforms. And the real question is, will those Democrat lawmakers and to some degree Republican lawmakers fear their voters in 2022 more than they fear the blowback from a teachers union in their local environment? So I think education reform is going to be somewhat dependent on how that plays out, and the role that President Biden might take in trying to navigate that. But also I think another thing that is going on in the country, going back to some of the earlier discussion, we really do have a cultural battle between free enterprise and what free enterprise is really about. Free enterprise is really about persuasion. The essence of capitalism is an entrepreneur starts a business, puts some money in, gets some investor money, hires some people to do what? Serve other people well. And if you serve other people well, you're rewarded by the market and individuals in that market. And if you serve them poorly, you're not. And it's all voluntary for the most part, with some exceptions. On the other hand, socialism, as we have come to know, is really about coercion. It's about the government having power to impose its ideas about how you should consume goods and how you should interact. Meanwhile, at the same time, as I said earlier, we have this battle between the melting pot and people really getting along in their daily life, but then the conflict that really, in group identity politics and the cancel culture, that really does benefit the political class and the media class. How is the Institute, National Review Institute, going to approach these very complex problems and try to play a role in navigating that?
Well, that's like an essay question.
You've got about 14 minutes. Go.
Got a lot out there. Yeah, no, but I think that the main sort of cohesive point for all of those different points that you made is really articulating to people in a persuasive and, as I said, respectful way what the differences are between having the government mandate, regulate, dictate, whatever word you want to use, to you in your personal life, in your business, in other businesses that will then affect you, versus free enterprise and freedom of choice for yourself and for your businesses and for your family. And I think that that is a really important lesson for all of us to, again, remind ourselves about. And as I said, I went back to the founders, but we also, as an organization, we talk a lot about Bill Buckley, our founder, and about his legacy, about also just being very strong and clear, and again, respectful, but about your convictions. And then your job as an advocate is persuasion, right? Your job is not just to like say, this is what free enterprise is, and this is how the progressives are going to take that away. But actually, your role is to gain ground, to bring more people over, to figure out ways to have common ground so that you can then bring people over and be more persuadable. And I think that, to your point, though, about school choice and what Emily and Robert had said, I think that this is an immensely wonderful, to use probably a bad term, opportunity for the school choice movement, because so many people not just are choosing homeschooling because they're having to do homeschooling, but I'm hearing from all kinds of people how shocked they are at the content or a lack of content that's in their children's schoolwork that they're basically doing with them at home. And this is a fabulous, fabulous opportunity. And, you know, we can quote our good friends on the progressive left, like, don't let a crisis go to waste. I think that this is the #1 area where we can do that. We can really break the mold and be able to give choice of content, as well as a choice of just sort of opportunity of different schooling to parents of all economic levels, and no matter where you are in the country. And that is really, really promising.
I think that's been one of the most shocking things we've all experienced in our communities, in our family life, is that window into the classroom has been quite extraordinary in terms of what's going on all across America and educating children. And I think people had no idea what was going on. There were all these sort of anecdotal stories over the years of strange things going on in classrooms, indoctrination and other crazy ideas being taught. But those were always sort of in isolation. Now you have this pipeline into the classroom on a daily basis in hundreds of millions of homes, or tens of millions of homes every day, and I think people have gotten a real education. I do think that is one of the reasons we should be optimistic about education reform. Robert, what's your next column going to be about? You're on mute, Robert.
I did the. I thought I was going to get through this without doing that once. Anyway. Well, it's going to be. Is it going to be expanding on some of these things we've been talking about? One, a little bit on Republicans, trying to reconnect with their Party of Lincoln roots, because as President Trump has said a few times, not too many people know that Abraham Lincoln was a Republican. Well, some of us did, and then also looking at some of these other things that we've been talking about that I think it's great for the country if both parties are competing for non-white votes. I mean, that's ultimately a good thing. And ironically, Donald Trump, who in many ways has been the most divisive president in many years, partly because of him and because of Joe Biden's appeal to some different groups, the racial polarization in terms of voting actually shrank, because the non-white vote expanded a little bit on the Republican side, and the white vote, particularly college whites, moved more on the Democratic side. So yay, shrinking racial polarization in voting.
Yeah, shrinking polarization in general, I think, would be good for all of us. I think we all would like to see that occur. Emily, any thoughts in our closing minutes? We have about 8 or 9 minutes left. Would you like to share with us? What's coming up?
Well,
Tell us a bit more about the polls that are going on. And also, I'm just curious, as a quick aside, when the election happened, Cato is legendary for having people kind of across the spectrum. Were there dance parties? Was there a kegger opened up by some? Were others curled in fetal positions crying? What actually happened in the back rooms at the Cato Institute?
Well, I suppose that a benefit of a global pandemic is that you don't know those things because we're all working from home and just talking over Zoom. I actually think that's a great benefit of the Cato Institute, and a strength is that we are not partisan. There isn't just like one side. So I think there were some people that were pleased with the results, some people who were less pleased with the results. And honestly, different administrations affect different policy areas in different ways, right? So the Biden administration is going to have a different set of perspectives on economic policy than the Trump administration did, and vice versa on immigration. So different people have new challenges in whatever scenario that we're in. But the thing I'm really going to be thinking a lot about is how to start rebuilding social trust. I think we're far from it right now. I think that this election is more of a symptom of an underlying tectonic shift that we're seeing. We saw it play out in the UK with Brexit. We saw it in 2016 with Trump. I think that there are some considerable concerns that people have in an era of fast-paced change, globalization, mass migration, that just those changes require having a more open and honest conversation of the many benefits and the costs and kind of the growing pains that accompany fast-paced change. Right now, I think that some people feel like a winning strategy in this environment is to kind of bully the other side, to try to kind of push people into such a position where they feel like they have to stay silent. The problem with that is that it undermines confidence in our institutions. And I think we've seen an example of the consequences of that with this global pandemic and the lack of confidence that many people have in our nation's media institutions. People feel that many members of the media have not been living up to their own standards of impartial and objective reporting. Instead, they feel like there's a lot of like where the media is trying to kind of push people in a particular direction. And I think a lot of people don't like that. And so when there's a global pandemic and we really don't have, like as individuals, we're not scientists, we don't all have the information that we need. We kind of need to rely on the expertise of people who know more than us. But if people don't trust them to be open and honest, fair and impartial in the information they provide, that makes it so people aren't going to believe them. And so you get this politicization of a scientific problem like the pandemic, where people have different views about the efficacy of masks and social distancing and all of these issues. People are thinking differently about the trade-offs associating with shutting down economies and the deleterious effects it has on households across the income spectrum and on mental health and all of these things. So these are problems that are exacerbated when we can't have kind of an open and honest conversation and a zeitgeist that prevents that. And it's exacerbated with low social trust. I think that a lot has to be done to be talking about the role that institutions, universities, media, entertainment, social media platforms, how all of these entities are playing a role and how people are reacting and responding. I think that a lot of persuasion needs to go into this, where we have to kind of really understand that the way to change minds and hearts and to persuade people doesn't really come through browbeating and through kind of bullying and encouraging a self-censorship. But really, persuasion comes through having a more open and sincere dialogue with one another. And that sincerity, I think, is what's been missing from a lot of our public debate. And so I'm hopeful in the coming months and coming years that perhaps people are starting to wake up to that. The fact that this election was so much closer than all of the people who seem to know things, right, predicted, that perhaps it's time to rethink some of our priors.
That's well said, Emily. And I had a college professor long ago who once said in political science that said the only thing to be intolerant of is intolerance itself. And I think you've made that point really clearly about we have to have greater acceptance of people who have views other than ours. And I was talking to a friend of mine, African-American friend of mine, this summer in the height of the post-George Floyd killing and the Black Lives Matter, rising the Black Lives Matter movement and all that was. And we had quite a discussion about Black Lives Matter, capital B, capital M, capital L, capital M as an organization versus capital little b, little l, little m as a sentiment and a movement and a moral cause. And his comment to me, as we were going back and forth about this in a very wonderful way, he said that, you know, when you want to, it's fair to distinguish, but sometimes when you want to distinguish the two, people feel they're not being heard. And I think that's a really important point, because listening and being heard is how you begin to develop that trust that you're talking about. And I think the same thing is true for Trump supporters. I think the reason you saw those spontaneous rallies, the trunk trains, the boat parades, and all the rest of it, these are people who have long felt that they too are not heard in a completely different way, not the same dimension, obviously, of the moral dilemma and the challenge between what's going on with racial justice and what's going on with Trump supporters. Very different things. I'm not comparing those two or saying they're the same, but I'm saying it has to do with people feeling unheard. And I think that it goes back to something that you said a moment ago, Lindsay, which is, you know, how do we, one of the ways I like to talk about it is how do we sell our ideas in the language the audience consumes? Too often we want to sell our ideas in the language we consume, in the language we like. This is called the Liberty Forum. A lot of people think the word liberty is strange. I've had many of my friends from the African American community, when we do the Gifts of the Free Market Christmas party we do every year, they tell me that that language is off-putting to them. And it never would have occurred to me that that language is off-putting, but it is. And I think we all have to, and of course in your polling, Emily, I think this is an opportunity down the road. We really have to think more about how we communicate, and this is for everyone. Yes, Robert.
And just jumping on what you just said there, John. I mean, I think that's a really important point, because we in political circles and in movement circles, when we talk about liberty and freedom, it comes across in an academic setting. Whereas for African Americans who have maybe grandfathers or great-great-grandparents who were slaves, that concept of liberty and freedom is not academic, and you're absolutely right. You know, recognizing that reality is essential, and if we're trying to get converts or just people to strike up a conversation with us.
Thank you very much for that. Lindsay, final thoughts here in the final couple minutes that we have. Would you like to wrap up your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I just want to say that I think that in this kind of an international setting, there's so much that we in the liberty movement, to use that word again, here in the US can learn from our partners overseas. And I think that since the enemies of the free market and of freedom are on the march here in the United States, we can all work together to make sure that they don't really take hold the way they want to here in the US. And I think that's a really important task in front of all of us in the years and months ahead.
Thank you. To all of you watching, I would like to suggest that at home you do a very nice golf clap for our three excellent panelists, Robert A. George, Emily Ekins, and Lindsay Very Young Craig. Thank you all so much for being with us today. Thank you for sharing your thoughts and your expertise. And in particular, thank you for setting up the sets behind you so elegantly and beautifully. Very well done, I might say. Thank you. And that will wrap us up. Thank you all so much for joining us. I think what we've learned today is that whatever side you may have been on in terms of the presidential election in the United States, the American people really do have incredible wisdom. When you think about how narrow this vote was, but yet they had the wisdom in their other voting up and down the ballot to make sure that our government would not be all in one direction or all in the other direction when we, the people, are still so divided. And I think divided government at a time when we're searching for an American consensus, trying to find out what our country's 21st century destiny shall be, that is actually going to be good in the long run, because it will force all of us to be a little more accepting of one another and a little more tolerant, and we certainly can use that. Now, the good news is that we're just getting started at the 2020 Atlas Network Liberty Forum. We're going to take a break till about 12:15. If you take a look at your agenda, someplace on that magical computer that you have, you will find concurrent sessions starting at 12:15 Eastern Time. So what I recommend is you do what is necessary, find another cocktail, or like me, you could take this straight glass of vodka and just put a little toast to 2020 being behind us. Thank you all so much and have a great rest of the day.
Hands up if you're down to get down tonight, 'cause it's always a good